It was a killing caught on video in May last year that even during a pandemic moved huge numbers of Americans to take to the streets.
What do we want?
For all the outrage, it's rare in the US for a police officer to even be put on trial when they kill. But Derek Chauvin was.
All rise for the jury.
Over the past 3 weeks, we saw for the first time George Floyd in the lead-up to the interaction in which he was killed.
For the record, this is at 7.
We saw as he struggled with and was pushed to the ground by police after being suspected of having used a fake banknote.
Y'all hear me? Don't do me like that, man. Please. Okay, can I talk to you, please?
It's you get in this car, we can talk.
We saw time and again how the case had affected those who'd seen the events play out in front of their own eyes, including a girl whose video of the killing went viral, who wasn't shown in court.
It's been nights. I stayed up apologizing and apologizing to George Floyd for not doing more and not physically interacting and not saving his life.
We saw police categorically refute claims Derek Chauvin had been following training.
To continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy, it is not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
And the defense claim that George Floyd happened to die of something else was also rejected.
A healthy person subjected to what Mr. Floyd was subjected to would have died as a result.
Once it was in the jury's hands, they took less than 10 hours to return a unanimous verdict.
Find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of
What
April,
followed
2021.
were guilty verdicts in the remaining 2 counts, and Derek Chauvin looking at a lengthy term in prison.
That was Elaine McBall, and he's here now. It was interesting hearing the family lawyer for George Floyd saying this was going to be a turning point in history. Big words. Do you get that sense of this significance? Do you think that's misplaced optimism or right?
It's certainly a huge moment. As you heard in that report, it's very rare even for police officers to go on trial when they kill. So the fact that he's been convicted is a big moment. And, you know, a lot of the people watching right now will wonder why it was ever in the balance when they saw that kind of egregious act all caught on video. But it's the way that the system works in the US. It has to be a unanimous verdict. And also there was an extraordinary jury selection process where, you know, some jurors, prospective jurors said, well, they watched that video and they could never unsee it, and they were dismissed as a prospective juror. Another one said, well, it didn't leave them with a good impression of the officer, and they were also dismissed. So a lot felt like it was in the balance. But I'm thinking now of some of the other cases I've covered over the last 5 or 6 years. There was a case of a man called Eric Garner in New York who was killed in a chokehold by police officers after being suspected of selling single cigarettes on the street. His mother took 5 years just to get that officer dismissed from his role, and he was never prosecuted. So for some, things are inching forward, but it is a case, this one, that has a particular profile. It was particularly a particularly egregious act, a particular amount of pressure from around the world. So while it will allow police, and I'm sure they will do this, to say, see, we do have accountability, I think a lot of people across the US will look at all these other cases and say a lot more needs to be done. It is not just about this one particular case. And as we've pointed out before, even during the 3 weeks of this trial, other people have been killed at the hands of the police, and they won't have the same profile, they won't have the same pressure on the legal system as this one did.
Elaine, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's go to our guest to discuss this. in more detail now. We're joined by C.K. Hoffler, the president of the National Bar Association, former U.S. Attorney for Minnesota, Rachel Paulos, and Cedric Frazier, Minnesota State Representative. It's good to speak to you all. C.K. Hoffler, if I can start with you. It was a sort of strange verdict, this, because we knew that there had been this unanimous decision, and yet we didn't actually hear about it for several hours. Was this pretty much what you were expecting once the jury came back so quickly?
It is what I was expecting. I felt that if the jury deliberated for another day or another couple days, that it would be a bad sign, because that would mean to me that there was a lot of interfighting or disagreement as to what the verdict should be on any one of the counts. But I think with the jury coming back relatively quickly, given the complexity of the case, given the amount of evidence, and given that these jurors probably took their time to comb through the evidence to make sure that they were methodical and meticulous, given what was at stake, not just with the George Floyd's family and the Derek Chauvin and this Derek Chauvin trial, but just the social justice aspect of this. And I'm sure it wasn't lost on the jurors. I think when they came back in a relatively quick period of time, given the evidence, that I felt very comfortably there would be a guilty verdict. I wasn't sure on which counts. I prayed there would be on the more severe the most severe charge, second-degree murder. And of course, I knew that if they came back with second-degree murder, they would come back with third-degree murder, and they would come back with second-degree manslaughter, because a lot of the elements for the second-degree murder were contained in the third-degree murder. And, you know, the manslaughter is something in my world of looking at it equivalent to negligence, culpable negligence. And because it's a lesser offense, I knew if they got the top offense, all the others would follow. That's what I felt.
Do you think the trial was actually over the moment the jurors were shown that video that had already been circulated around the world? I mean, do you think from that respect it was an open and shut case, because the prosecution was saying just use your gut, weren't they?
Well, you know, there's no such thing, if you're a trial lawyer, as an open and shut case. You can have a compelling case, you can have compelling evidence, but it's up to 14 strangers who don't know the family, who don't really care about all the issues that you may care about, for you to persuade them. I think they had certainly a compelling case. That video for me made it exceptionally compelling for me. And I was going to trust my eyes, just as the prosecution asked us to do. But I didn't know how those jurors would perceive that evidence, because it's an amazing thing. Having tried it so many cases, you may think you're rocking and rolling and some evidence is absolutely magnificent, and the jurors it may go right over their head and they might miss it completely. So I do think that the defense took nothing for granted. The prosecution took nothing for granted and laid out a case methodically. They were meticulous and they were thorough. Yeah. And I think that is why the verdict came in the way that it did. In addition to the fact, you know, just trust your eyes. And I think that's what...
Let me let you shut your call off for a second, and I'll go to State Senator Cedric Frazier. Do you think this changes how Minnesotans are feeling about their state tonight? I mean, you've seen the crowds and you've seen that those protesters were there at George Floyd corner, whatever the verdict was going to be. What is your sense now, Cedric?
Thank you for having me. I think people are happy and relieved that this was the outcome, because this is accountability and this is what folks want. You interviewed a woman and a gentleman early on, and he talked about the first time him moving to this state and to this country, that he felt fear when he went out and he drove in his car, that he may not come back because he may have an interaction with a police officer. That fear doesn't go away because this officer was convicted. The only thing that happens now is that this is just one step. This is accountability, but we still have so much work to do to make sure that a person like George Floyd, a person like Daunte Wright, that they don't die, that they do get to come home at the end of the day. So we still have a lot of work to do, but I do think people are celebrating and people are happy that this is the outcome that they were looking for, and this is the outcome that they absolutely should have had, because this Mr. Chauvin absolutely murdered George Floyd.
And do you think that they got this verdict because things are changing in America, or because the whole murder was caught on tape?
I want to hope that things are changing, but in reality, Daunte Wright was just killed less than a week ago. And so we know that things haven't changed yet. I think the fact that this sparked a movement around the world and the world was watching may have played a role. I think the video was egregious. I think the jury was diverse, and you often don't get. I practice in this county. You often don't get a jury that is diverse. So you probably had folks that had more proximity and more understanding to how those interactions with police officers go, and they understood that. But I don't know. I want to be hopeful that we're changing, but at this point, I really don't know because we just lost another unarmed Black man just days ago.
Let me ask Rachel Pellows, the legal steps now of what happens next. What kind of sentencing will Derek Chauvin be looking at, do you think? What will he appeal? What happens from here on?
Well, we know that the maximum sentence for second-degree murder is 40 years. The maximum sentence for third-degree murder is 25 years. The maximum sentence for involuntary manslaughter is 10 years. If the judge chose to stack all those sentences, Derek Chauvin could be facing essentially the rest of his life in prison. More typically in Minnesota, judges sentence defendants to serve concurrent terms. We do know that the state will be seeking a sentence that's higher than what's typically in the range of what we call the sentencing guidelines. It's a matrix that judges use to calculate a sentence, which in this case would be about 12 and a half years for the most serious charge of which Mr. Chauvin was convicted. But the state believes that there are aggravating factors here, and we've already seen a preview of those aggravating factors during the trial. The fact that the crime was committed in front of little children, the fact that the defendant committed the crime while in uniform, the fact that the defendant committed the crime in concert with other officers, the fact that the defendant committed the crime under color of official authority. All of these reasons, the state will say, are reasons to go upward from the otherwise applicable sentence and seek a more harsh sentence against Derek Chauvin.
And can he appeal? Would you expect him to appeal? Will he go directly to prison?
Well, he has been detained, and so the judge did order him to be taken into custody immediately. So he is in prison right now, but he also has 3 more bites at the apple to appeal his sentence to higher courts. And we know from pleadings that he has already filed, that his lawyer has already filed, that he intends to raise a number of grounds as potential issues for appeal, including the issue of pretrial publicity. And so I think it would be shocking if he didn't appeal, given that every defendant does, just as a matter of course, even if they are convicted on all counts. And so we can expect this case to work its way through the system. But this jury has sent a very strong message, deliberating basically less than 1 business day to render a unanimous verdict on all 3 counts, which we've never seen a conviction against a white officer for killing an African-American man. We've never seen a charge this serious really in any court in the country for basically felony assault, alleging, and now this jury finding, that Derek Chauvin assaulted and killed George Floyd.
C.K. Hoffler, there will be many in law enforcement, and indeed we had one gentleman on last night who said, don't make this bigger than it is. It's about one man who committed murder, which is clearly a terrible thing, one man too many, but don't make this about all law enforcement and all officers everywhere. Do you expect law enforcement to change as a result of this? Would you want it to now?
I absolutely.
I do want law enforcement.
Sorry, to C.K. Hoffler.
Yes. Well, I do think this was a trial. The prosecutor said this is a trial about one man. It's the state against this one man. But I believe that this is about more than just one man. But it's not the end all be all. This is the starting point for change. And now, because there is a message being sent to law enforcement, there is a message being sent to the police unions, the all-powerful police unions in our country. Because this could be a game changer, but it's only going to be a game changer if we push for widespread reform on a federal level, which is the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and on a state level, state by state by state and localities. We cannot just rest on the laurels of this one case, but I do think it's much bigger than this one case, because it's the beginning of something that could be really a very, very positive movement, and it could be a game changer in the history of our country. But it's not going to be just stopping right here. It's going to be after a lot of work takes place.
Let me ask State Senator Frazier then, do you think there is the political appetite on a federal level to actually change the power that those police unions have?
I hope so. I mean, you saw the global spark that this caused. You saw the civil unrest that it caused in our country, the civil unrest that it continues to cause because we're still seeing Black people being killed by law enforcement officers. So I hope that it brings the political will and the political might to do so. But what CJ said, it's also a state-by-state issue. I know we're in the middle of our session right now, hearing police accountability and reform bills that we're pushing to pass. And we have a divided legislature. But for the first time this session, we had our Republican, I'm a Democrat, we had our Republican side say, hey, we need to start having hearings to talk about these issues. So I'm hoping that with this verdict, it sets a precedent that we need to do more, and we need to do more now to make sure we don't have any more George Floyds and we don't have any more Dante Wrights.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for joining us on Newsnight.